A Future's Seeds. New York, 1917. Isabella Hawkins unearthed an old journal at a forgotten flea market, its pages filled with desperate entries ending with "I will return," signed by Sergeant Edward Ross. Chapter 1. Dust and Whispers of the Past. The air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of aged paper and forgotten things. Isabella Hawkins loved this flea market, tucked away in a quiet corner of New York City, far from the bustling avenues and the ever-present whispers of war. 1917 had cast a long shadow, even here, across the Atlantic. The newsreels at the cinema showed blurred images of trenches and explosions, and the casualty lists in the newspapers grew longer each day. But in this small, forgotten space, time seemed to slow, offering a temporary reprieve from the anxieties of the present. Isabella traced a finger across a chipped porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the comforting familiarity of the past. Her life felt stalled. Her fiancé, Thomas, was somewhere in France, a lieutenant in the infantry. His letters were infrequent, filled with carefully chosen words that revealed little of the true horrors he must be facing. She clung to them, rereading them until the paper softened and threatened to tear, searching for some hidden message, some reassurance that he was still himself. She moved deeper into the labyrinthine stalls, her fingers brushing against faded fabrics, tarnished silverware, and stacks of old books. It was in one of these stacks, tucked beneath a pile of yellowed sheet music, that she found it. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age. The leather was cracked in places, the stitching loose, but it possessed a strange, almost magnetic pull. Isabella hesitated, feeling a flicker of guilt. It felt like intruding, like uncovering something meant to remain hidden. But the weight of the journal in her hand, the silent promise of untold stories, was too strong to resist. She paid the vendor, a wizened old man with eyes that seemed to hold a century of secrets, a few coins, and tucked the journal into her bag. Back in her small apartment, overlooking a bustling street that never seemed to sleep, Isabella poured herself a cup of tea. The city noises, the clatter of trams, the distant shouts of vendors faded into the background as she sat by the window, the journal resting in her lap. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the dust motes dancing in the air with gold. She opened the journal carefully, her heart beating a little faster. The first page was blank, save for a faint, almost invisible inscription, "For whoever finds this, may it bring you something." Isabella frowned. Something? What? Hope? Comfort? Warning? She turned the page. The handwriting was strong, masculine, the ink faded to a sepia tone. The first entry was dated June 12, 1915. June 12, 1915, the rain hasn't stopped for 3 days. Everything is mud. Mud and blood. I saw Miller go down today. A shell. There was nothing left. I keep thinking about his wife, Mary. He showed me a picture of her, just before he was going to name his first son after me. Edward. Ironic, isn't it? Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't some romantic tale, some fanciful diary. This was raw, visceral. This was the war, stripped bare of its patriotic gloss. She continued reading, her tea growing cold, forgotten. The entries were sporadic, some short and brutal, others longer, filled with a desperate longing for home. The writer, a man named Edward, described the relentless shelling, the fear that gnawed at the edges of his sanity, the camaraderie forged in the face of death. He wrote of the endless waiting, the boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. He wrote of the dreams he had, dreams of green fields and clear skies, dreams so vivid they felt more real than the mud and the rats and the stench of decay. July 2nd, 1915, they say we're going over the top tomorrow. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's a way to cheat death just for a little while. To leave something behind. I keep thinking about her. Her smile. The way she used to laugh. I wonder if she even remembers me. Isabella felt a lump forming in her throat. Who was she? A lover? A wife left behind? The journal offered no clues, only fragments of a life interrupted, a love story seemingly cut short by the brutal reality of war. She read on, drawn into Edward's world, his fears and his hopes becoming her own. She felt a strange connection to this man, this stranger, separated from her by time and distance, yet bound to her by the shared experience of human suffering. The journal became a lifeline, a whisper of truth in a world filled with lies and propaganda. August 18th, 1915. I saw a robin today. A single, red-breasted robin, perched on a broken branch just beyond the wire. It sang for a moment, a clear, sweet song that cut through the noise of the guns. It felt like a sign, a promise. I don't know what of, but it gave me hope, just for a little while. Isabella found herself smiling, a fragile, watery smile. Even in the midst of hell, there was beauty. Even in the face of death, there was hope. She turned the page, eager for the next entry, the next glimpse into Edward's life. But the page was blank. And the next. And the next. The journal was filled with empty pages, the story unfinished. Isabella felt a pang of disappointment, a sense of loss that was almost overwhelming. Then, on the very last page, she found it. A single, final entry, written in the same strong hand, but the ink was darker, fresher, as if it had been written more recently. October 27th, 1915. I will return. Beneath it, a signature. Sergeant Edward Ross. Isabella stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. I will return. A promise? A vow? Or just a desperate, futile hope whispered into the void? And to whom was he returning? The she in his earlier entries? Or someone else? The mystery deepened, the journal's silence amplifying the unanswered questions. Who was Sergeant Edward Ross? And did he ever make it home? The journal was a map, a fractured path, and the final entry sent a cold shiver and hot tear down Isabella's cheek, setting her world on a new trajectory. Chapter 2. The Sergeant's First Entry. Isabella closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the worn leather. The words "I will return" echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain that refused to be silenced. Sergeant Edward Ross. The name felt both familiar and foreign, a whisper from a past she was now inexplicably drawn into. She looked around her small apartment, at the familiar objects that suddenly seemed distant and unreal. The world outside, with its bustling streets and its own quiet anxieties, felt miles away. She opened the journal again, drawn back to the beginning, to the first entry. June 12th, 1915. The rain hasn't stopped for 3 days. Everything is mud. Mud and blood. She tried to picture him, this Sergeant Ross, huddled in a trench, surrounded by the horrors of war. She imagined him young, perhaps not much older than Thomas, her fiancé. Strong, but vulnerable. Brave, but terrified. The image of Miller, the soldier who had died, haunted her. He was going to name his first son after me. Edward. Ironic, isn't it? The casual cruelty of war, the way it snatched away lives and futures, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. Isabella thought of Thomas, fighting somewhere in France, facing the same dangers, the same uncertainties. A wave of fear washed over her, so intense it left her breathless. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the journal, on Edward's words. It was a strange comfort, reading his entries. A way to connect with the reality of the war, to understand, even in a small way, what Thomas might be going through. A way to feel closer to him, despite the vast ocean that separated them. She reread the entry about the robin. A single, red-breasted robin, perched on a broken branch just beyond the wire. It sang for a moment, a clear, sweet song that cut through the noise of the guns. It felt like a sign. Isabella closed her eyes, imagining the scene. The desolate landscape, the barbed wire, the constant thunder of artillery. And then the robin, a tiny spark of beauty, a fragile symbol of hope. She realized she was clutching the journal tightly, her knuckles white. She loosened her grip, her fingers tracing the outline of the faded ink. She felt a growing determination, a need to know more, to find out what happened to Sergeant Edward Ross, to uncover the rest of his story. The next day, Isabella found herself back at the flea market. The wizened old man, whose name she learned was Mr. Abernathy, was sitting in his usual spot, surrounded by his collection of forgotten treasures. He looked up as she approached, his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, seeming to peer into her very soul. "Back again, are you?" he asked, his voice raspy with age. "That journal, it spoke to you, didn't it?" Isabella nodded, surprised by his perceptiveness. "Yes," she said. "It did. I need to know more about the man who wrote it." Sergeant Edward Ross. Mr. Abernathy stroked his chin, his gaze drifting towards the stacks of books and dusty relics. "Edward Ross," he murmured, as if tasting the name. "A common enough name. But that journal, it's not so common. Do you remember where you got it?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. He hesitated, his eyes clouding over with memory. "It's been a while," he said slowly. "Came in with a lot of other things from an estate sale, I believe. Upstate. A big, old house been in the family for generations. Do you remember the family's name?" He shook his head. "Can't say that I do. It was years ago." But he paused, a flicker of something recognition in his eyes. There was a woman, an elderly woman. She was the one selling the things. Seemed reluctant, like she was parting with more than just objects. "Do you remember anything about her? Anything at all?" Mr. Abernathy closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "She was refined. Spoke with a slight accent, British, maybe? And she had a sadness about her, like she was carrying a heavy burden." Isabella felt a surge of hope. A British accent? Could it be the she Edward had written about in his journal? The woman he had longed to return to? Did she say anything about the journal? About Edward Ross? "Not directly," Mr. Abernathy said. "But I remember she held it for a long time before she finally let it go. And she said something about unfinished business. That's all I remember." Unfinished business. The words resonated with Isabella, confirming her own growing conviction that Edward's story was not yet complete. She thanked Mr. Abernathy, her mind already racing, formulating a plan. She needed to find that house, that elderly woman. She needed to find the missing pieces of Edward's story. And perhaps, in doing so, she would find a way to navigate her own uncertain future, her own fears and anxieties about the war and the man she loved, so far away. She pressed a few more coins in the old man's hand, a silent offering. The city noise seemed to fade away, replaced only by the determined beat of her heart. Chapter 3. A world away, yet so close. The following days were a blur of activity. Isabella spent hours at the New York Public Library, poring over maps and directories, searching for any mention of estate sales in upstate New York from years past. The task seemed daunting, almost impossible. The war had consumed so much, disrupted so many lives, that finding a single thread from the past felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. She also visited the Red Cross, hoping they might have records of soldiers who had served, perhaps even of a Sergeant Edward Ross. The volunteers were kind and helpful, but their records were incomplete, overwhelmed by the sheer number of men who had gone to war. She looked out her window at the city, at the distance, and knew her life, for better or worse, had shifted. Chapter 4. Shadows of War in New York. The train journey to Riverwood was long and slow, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant reminder of the distance she was traveling, both physically and emotionally. Isabella gazed out the window, watching the cityscape give way to rolling hills and farmland. The autumn colors were at their peak, the trees ablaze with fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. It was a beautiful landscape, yet even here, the shadow of war was palpable. She saw young men in uniform, waiting on station platforms, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She saw women, their eyes etched with worry, waving goodbye, clutching handkerchiefs and offering silent prayers. She saw posters urging people to buy war bonds, to conserve food, to support the troops. The war was everywhere, inescapable. Even in this seemingly peaceful corner of the world, The conflict in Europe felt close, a constant undercurrent of anxiety and uncertainty. Isabella thought of Edward's journal, of his descriptions of the mud and the blood and the relentless shelling. She wondered how anyone could survive such horrors, how they could return to a normal life after witnessing such unimaginable brutality. She thought of Thomas and the carefully guarded tone of his letters. He never complained, never spoke of the fear or the suffering. He always tried to reassure her, to tell her that everything was fine. But Isabella knew better. She knew that he was hiding the truth, shielding her from the reality of his experience. As the train neared Riverwood, Isabella felt a growing sense of anticipation, mixed with a healthy dose of trepidation. She had no idea what she would find, whether she would be able to locate the woman who had sold the journal, or whether her search would prove to be a futile, dead end. Riverwood was a small, picturesque town, nestled along the banks of the Hudson River. The main street was lined with quaint shops and houses, their facades adorned with colorful flower boxes. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. It felt like a world away from the bustling, noisy streets of New York City. Isabella's first stop was the local post office. She figured it was the best place to start her inquiries. The postmistress, a friendly woman with a warm smile, listened patiently as Isabella explained her quest. Edward Ross, the postmistress repeated, her brow furrowed in thought. The name doesn't ring a bell, I'm afraid. But Riverwood is a small town. Everyone knows everyone. Or at least they used to. She sighed, a hint of sadness in her voice. The war has changed things. So many young men gone, so many families affected. I'm looking for an elderly woman, Isabella explained. British, I believe. She sold some things at a flea market in New York City a few years ago, including a soldier's journal. The postmistress's eyes lit up. You must be talking about Mrs. Ainsworth, she said. She lived in the old Montgomery estate, just outside of town. A grand, old house been in the family for generations. Isabella's heart leaped. The Montgomery estate. It matched Mr. Abernathy's description. Is she still there? The postmistress hesitated. She passed away, I'm afraid. About a year ago. A lovely woman she was. Always kind. Always generous. But she carried a great sadness, especially in her later years. Isabella felt a pang of disappointment. She had come so close, only to find that the woman she was seeking was gone. But then, the postmistress added, her daughter still lives there. Eleanor Ainsworth. She took over the estate after her mother passed. Eleanor Ainsworth. A new name, a new possibility. Isabella thanked the postmistress and, with a renewed sense of hope, set out to find the Montgomery estate. She walked down streets, a stranger in a strange, quiet world. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, but even this natural beauty felt subdued, respectful of her mission, of her searching, and of the secrets the town held close. Chapter 5. The Unsent Letter. The Montgomery estate was even grander than Isabella had imagined. A long, winding driveway led up to a sprawling, two-story house, built of gray stone and surrounded by ancient oak trees. The house had a faded elegance, a sense of history that spoke of generations past. It also felt neglected. The gardens were overgrown, the paint on the windowsills was peeling, and a general air of melancholy hung over the property. Isabella hesitated at the gate, her hand hovering over the rusty latch. She felt a sudden wave of doubt. What if Eleanor Ainsworth refused to see her? What if she was unwilling to share any information about Edward Ross? What if the entire journey had been a waste of time? She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the journal, of Edward's words, of the promise he had made. I will return. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She pushed open the gate and walked up the driveway, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. As she approached the front door, she noticed a figure standing in one of the windows, watching her. A woman, tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back from her face. Eleanor Ainsworth, she presumed. Isabella raised her hand to knock, but before she could, The door swung open. Eleanor Ainsworth stood before her, her expression unreadable. She was younger than Isabella had expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with striking blue eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. "Can I help you?" Eleanor asked, her voice polite but guarded. "My name is Isabella Hawkins," Isabella began, her voice trembling slightly. I found something. Something that I believe belonged to your mother." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is it?" Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal. She held it out to Eleanor, her hand shaking. "This," she said. "It's a soldier's journal, written by a man named Sergeant Edward Ross." Eleanor's reaction was unexpected. Her face paled, her eyes widening in shock. She took a step back, as if she had been struck. "Edward," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Where did you find this?" "At a flea market in New York City," Isabella explained. "Your mother sold it, apparently, along with some other things." Eleanor reached out and took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather with a reverence that surprised Isabella. She opened it, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. I thought it was lost," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I would never see it again." Isabella felt a surge of relief. She had found the right person, the woman who could unlock the secrets of Edward's past. "Your mother, she said something about unfinished business," Isabella said gently. "Do you know what she meant?" Eleanor closed the journal, her gaze meeting Isabella's. "Yes," she said. "I do. It's a long story. A story that involves a great deal of pain and regret." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Come in," she said, gesturing towards the house. "It's time you knew the truth." Inside, the house was filled with shadows and silence. The furniture was old and heavy, covered in dust sheets. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Eleanor led Isabella into a dimly lit parlor, where a single lamp cast a pool of warm light on a worn armchair. "Please sit down," Eleanor said, indicating the chair. She sat opposite Isabella, the journal resting in her lap. "Edward Ross was my father," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He was a soldier in the British Army. He fought in France during the Great War." Isabella listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been right. Edward was the she in the journal, the woman he had loved, the woman he had longed to return to. "My mother, Margaret, met him in London, before the war," Eleanor continued. "They fell in love. They were going to be married. But then the war came. He was sent to France. And he never came back." A tear trickled. Isabella reached to hold her hand. Not in the way we hoped. "This," she pointed to the journal, "is all part of it. But there's more. A letter. An unsent letter." She rose, moved to a grand old desk. From a locked drawer, she removed a sealed, yellowed envelope. The paper was brittle, fragile. She handed to Isabella, and the subtle movement stirred the dust, the past, and the weight of unspoken grief in the room. Chapter 6. Isabella's growing obsession. Eleanor watched as Isabella carefully opened the envelope, her hands trembling with anticipation. The unsent letter was brittle with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Edward's. It was dated October 28, 1915, the day after his final journal entry. "My dearest Margaret, I'm writing this letter, knowing that it may never reach you. We're going over the top again tomorrow. The rumors are grim. They say it's going to be a bloodbath. I don't know if I'll survive. But I need you to know that I love you. More than life itself. I know I haven't been the best at writing. I've tried to shield you from the horrors of this war. But I can't keep it in any longer. It's hell here, Margaret. Absolute hell. I've seen things no human being should ever have to see. But through it all, I've held on to the thought of you. Your smile, your laughter, the way you make me feel alive. You are my reason for fighting. My reason for hoping. My reason for wanting to come home. If I don't make it, Margaret, please, don't grieve for me too long. Find someone else. Someone who can give you the life you deserve. A life filled with happiness and love. But never forget me. Never forget our love. I will return to you, Margaret. If not in this life, then in the next. I promise you. Yours eternally, Edward. Isabella finished reading the letter, tears streaming down her face. The raw emotion, the desperate love, the heartbreaking premonition of death, it was almost too much to bear. She looked at Eleanor, who was also weeping silently. He knew, Isabella whispered. He knew he wasn't going to survive. Eleanor nodded. He had a feeling, she said. He always did. He was sensitive, intuitive. But why wasn't the letter sent? Isabella asked. Why did your mother keep it all these years? Eleanor sighed, wiping her eyes. That's the complicated part, she said. My mother, she never received any official notification of my father's death. He was listed as missing in action. For years, she held on to hope. She believed he was still alive somewhere. A prisoner of war, perhaps. Or suffering from amnesia. She searched for him, Eleanor continued. She wrote letters, contacted the War Office, even traveled to France after the war, trying to find him. But it was no use. He had simply vanished. The letter, it was found among his belongings after the war, along with the journal. They were sent to my mother years later. By then, she had already given up hope. She kept the letter, Eleanor explained, as a reminder of his love, of his promise, but also as a reminder of the cruelty of war, of the way it stole her happiness, her future. Isabella carefully refolded the letter. Your mother, she was a brave woman, she noted softly. And you, following this journal, it's brought you here, hasn't it? It must be him, calling you to finish it, to find the real ending. Isabella nodded, her mind racing. The unsent letter had filled in some of the gaps, but it had also raised new questions. What had happened to Edward Ross? Had he died on that battlefield in October 1915? Or had he somehow survived, only to disappear, to vanish without a trace? The journal, the letter, Eleanor's story, it had all become an obsession. Isabella felt a compelling need to find the truth, to bring closure to Edward's story, to honor his memory. She knew that her own life, her own worries about Thomas, were intertwined with this quest. Eleanor, Isabella said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. I need to find out what happened to your father. I need to know the truth. Will you help me? Eleanor looked at Isabella, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. It's time. It's time the truth was known. The two women, bound together by a shared connection to a long-dead soldier, a shared grief, and a shared determination, embarked on a journey into the past, a journey that would test their courage, their resilience, and their faith in the enduring power of love. The house was filled with a renewed, albeit tentative, sense of purpose. The dust no longer felt as heavy. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Distant Battlefield. The next morning, Isabella and Eleanor began their investigation in earnest. They started by going through the boxes of Edward's belongings that Eleanor's mother had kept stored in the attic. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mothballs, the silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the rustling of old papers. They found photographs, letters, medals, and other mementos of Edward's life. There were pictures of him as a young boy, growing up in England. Pictures of him with Margaret, their faces radiant with love and happiness. Pictures of him in uniform, looking proud and determined, yet also somehow vulnerable. The letters were mostly from Margaret, filled with expressions of her love, her longing, her growing anxiety about his safety. There were also a few letters from Edward's fellow soldiers, offering condolences and sharing memories of him. One letter, in particular, caught Isabella's attention. It was from a soldier named Captain James Hamilton, who had apparently been Edward's commanding officer. It was dated November 10th, 1915, just a few weeks after Edward's last journal entry and unsent letter. Dear Mrs. Ainsworth, it is with the deepest regret that I must inform you that your fiancé, Sergeant Edward Ross, is missing in action. He was last seen during the offensive on October 28th. We have no further information regarding his whereabouts or his fate. Sergeant Ross was a brave and dedicated soldier, a credit to his regiment and his country. He was highly respected by his fellow officers and men. He will be sorely missed. I understand that this news will be devastating. Please accept my sincerest condolences. If any further information becomes available, I will, of course, inform you immediately. Yours sincerely, Captain James Hamilton. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. The letter confirmed what they already suspected. Edward had likely died on that battlefield. But the phrase missing in action left a sliver of doubt, a glimmer of hope. Missing doesn't necessarily mean dead, Isabella said, looking at Eleanor. He could have been captured. He could have been wounded and lost his memory. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes were filled with a deep sadness. I know, she said. My mother clung to that hope for years. But I think deep down she knew the truth. They continued searching through the boxes, hoping to find some clue, some piece of evidence that might shed light on Edward's fate. They found a small, silver locket containing a miniature portrait of Margaret. They found a tattered map of the area where Edward had been fighting. They found a blood-stained handkerchief embroidered with the initials ER. As they sifted through the relics of Edward's life, Isabella felt a growing sense of connection to him, to his world, to his love for Margaret. She felt as if she were stepping back in time, walking in his footsteps, experiencing his hopes and his fears. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling, as if the past were merging with the present. The echoes of the distant battlefield felt palpable now. We need to find Captain Hamilton, Isabella said suddenly. He might know more. He might have some information that wasn't included in the letter. Eleanor agreed. But how do we find him? She asked. It's been years. He could be anywhere. He could even be dead. Isabella thought for a moment. The Red Cross, she said. They might have records of officers who served. They might be able to help us track him down. They decided to return to New York City, to the Red Cross headquarters, to continue their search. As they left the Montgomery estate, Isabella looked back at the grand, old house, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. It felt like a place of ghosts, of secrets, of unanswered questions. She wondered if they would ever find the truth, if they would ever be able to bring peace to Edward's restless spirit. Outside, she breathed in the air, and the resolve felt like a solid weight in her chest, a determination to continue. Chapter 8. The Flea Market's Secret Keeper. Back in New York City, Isabella and Eleanor headed straight for the Red Cross headquarters. The building was bustling with activity, volunteers rushing back and forth, answering phones, sorting supplies, and attending to the needs of returning soldiers. The war effort was still in full swing, even though the fighting in Europe had been raging for years. They explained their situation to a sympathetic volunteer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. They showed her Captain Hamilton's letter, explaining that they were trying to track him down, hoping he might have information about Sergeant Edward Ross. The volunteer listened patiently, her expression growing thoughtful. Captain James Hamilton, she repeated, tapping a finger against her chin. The name sounds familiar. I seem to recall. Wait a moment. She disappeared into a back room, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork. Isabella and Eleanor waited anxiously, their hopes rising with each passing moment. After what seemed like an eternity, the volunteer returned, a smile on her face. I think I found something, she said. There's a file on a Captain James Hamilton. He was wounded in action in 1916, spent some time in a hospital in France, and then was repatriated to England. Is there an address? Isabella asked eagerly. The volunteer nodded. Yes, there is. A London address. It's a bit outdated, of course, but it's a starting point. She wrote down the address on a slip of paper and handed it to Isabella. I hope this helps, she said. Good luck with your search. Isabella and Eleanor thanked the volunteer profusely, their hearts filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They had a lead, a tangible connection to Edward's past. But London was a long way away, across the ocean, another world. As they left the Red Cross building, Isabella remembered something. Mr. Abernathy, the old man at the flea market. He had been the one who had sold her the journal, the one who had first mentioned Mrs. Ainsworth and Riverwood. He might know more, might have some other piece of information that could be helpful. They found Mr. Abernathy at his usual stall, surrounded by his eclectic collection of antiques and curiosities. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening in recognition. "The journal ladies," he said, a smile crinkling his weathered face. "Back again, are you? Have you solved the mystery?" Isabella explained their progress, their discovery of Eleanor, the unsent letter, and their search for Captain Hamilton. She showed him the London address they had obtained from the Red Cross. Mr. Abernathy listened intently, his gaze fixed on Isabella's face. When she had finished, he nodded slowly.
"I knew it," he said.
"I knew that journal was special. It had a story to tell, a story that needed to be heard." He paused, his eyes clouding over with memory. "There was something else," he said slowly. "Something about the woman, Mrs. Ainsworth, something." She said. He struggled to recall the details, his brow furrowed in concentration. "She mentioned a connection to London. Said she'd be returning one day." That seemed important, the way she paused, and her eyes got watery when she said it. It was a quick little sentence, but the way she said it stuck with me. Isabella and Eleanor exchanged a look. This was new information. It suggested that Mrs. Ainsworth might have had ties to London, perhaps even family or friends there. "Did she say anything else?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with urgency. "Anything about Captain Hamilton?" Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "No, I don't think so. But there was a name. She mentioned it was." He closed his eyes, trying to grasp the elusive memory. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. "Blythewood," he exclaimed. That was it. Blythewood. She said something about Blythewood. Blythewood. The name meant nothing to Isabella, but it might be a clue, a piece of the puzzle. It was something to go on. The old man looked at them, a strange expression on his face. "Be careful," he whispered. "Some secrets are best left buried." But Isabella knew that she could not. She had to press on, even if it meant facing painful truths. Chapter 9. A photograph and a name. Isabella and Eleanor left the flea market with a new piece of information, albeit a cryptic one. Blythewood. They had no idea what it meant: a place, a person, a family name. Their next stop was the New York Public Library, where they hoped to find some answers. They spent hours poring over maps, directories, and historical records, searching for any mention of Blythewood. They found a few references to a Blythewood manor in England, a small village in Scotland, and even a Blythewood shipping company, but nothing that seemed to connect directly to Mrs. Ainsworth or Edward Ross. Frustration began to mount. They were chasing shadows, grasping at straws. Isabella felt a growing sense of despair, wondering if they were on a wild goose chase, pursuing a mystery that was ultimately unsolvable. As they were about to give up, Eleanor, who had been browsing through a collection of old photographs, let out a gasp. "Isabella, look at this." Isabella hurried over to her side. Eleanor was pointing to a black and white photograph depicting a group of soldiers in uniform, standing in front of a building. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Officers of the 1st Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, London, 1914. Isabella scanned the faces in the photograph, her heart pounding. And then she saw him, a young man, standing in the back row, his face partially obscured by the soldier in front of him. But there was no mistaking the familiar features, the strong jawline, the intense gaze. It was Edward Ross. And standing next to him, his arm resting casually on Edward's shoulder, was another officer, a tall, handsome man with a confident smile. Isabella looked closely at his face, trying to memorize his features. Beneath the photo, there was a list of names, identifying the officers in the picture. Isabella's finger traced the list, her breath catching in her throat as she read, Captain James Hamilton. It was him, the man they had been searching for, the man who had written a letter to Margaret Ainsworth, informing her of Edward's disappearance. Seeing his face, his confident posture, brought a new sense of reality to their quest. He was no longer just a name on a piece of paper, but a real person, a key witness to Edward's fate. "We've found him," Isabella whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We've actually found him." Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining with tears. But the caption says 1914, she said. This photograph was taken before Edward went to France. Before everything happened. Isabella studied the photograph again, her gaze lingering on Edward's face. He looked so young, so full of life, so unburdened. It was hard to reconcile this image with the haunted, weary soldier who had written the journal entries, the man who had faced the horrors of the trenches. Look, Eleanor said quietly, placing her finger to the glass. There's an inscription on the back. They carefully removed the photograph from its sleeve and turned it over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a single sentence. To my dearest friend, Edward, may we always remember Blythewood.
James.
Blythewood. The name again. But this time, it was linked directly to Edward Ross and James Hamilton. It was no longer just a random word, but a place of shared significance, a memory that bound the two men together. It was their connection. Isabella felt a surge of hope. This photograph, this inscription, was a breakthrough. It confirmed their connection to Captain Hamilton, and it provided a new, potentially crucial lead. Blythewood. They needed to find out what Blythewood was, what it meant to Edward and James. They needed to go to London. The photograph felt heavy in her hands, the weight of history, of friendship, and of a looming truth pressing down. Chapter 10. The Red Cross Connection. The decision to go to London was not made lightly. It was a daunting prospect, crossing the Atlantic during wartime, with the ever-present threat of German U-boats lurking beneath the waves. It was also a significant financial undertaking, and Isabella and Eleanor had limited resources. But they were determined. They had come too far, uncovered too many secrets, to turn back now. They felt a responsibility to Edward, to Margaret, to uncover the truth about his fate, no matter the cost. Isabella sold some of her jewelry, a painful sacrifice, but one she was willing to make. Eleanor contributed what she could from her meager savings, the estate having fallen on hard times after her mother's death. They booked passage on a merchant ship, the SS Caledonia, scheduled to depart from New York in 2 weeks. In the meantime, they continued their research, trying to learn everything they could about Blythewood and Captain James Hamilton. They discovered that Blythewood Manor was indeed a real place, a stately home in the English countryside, located in the county of Sussex. It had been in the Hamilton family for generations. They also found more information about Captain Hamilton. He had been awarded the Military Cross for bravery, had been wounded several times, and had eventually risen to the rank of major. After the war, he had returned to Blythewood Manor, where he had apparently lived a quiet, reclusive life. Isabella decided to write to him, explaining their quest and requesting a meeting. She drafted the letter carefully, pouring her heart into it, hoping to appeal to his sense of duty, his compassion, his shared connection with Edward Ross. Major James Hamilton, my name is Isabella Hawkins, and I am writing to you from New York City. I am contacting you in connection with the late Sergeant Edward Ross, who served under your command in the 1st Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment during the Great War. I have in my possession Sergeant Ross's personal journal, as well as an unsent letter he wrote to his fiancée, Margaret Ainsworth, shortly before he was reported missing in action in October 1915. Miss Ainsworth's daughter, Eleanor, and I are trying to uncover the truth about Sergeant Ross's fate. We believe you may have information that could be crucial to our search. We are planning to travel to London in the near future, and we would be deeply grateful if you would agree to meet with us. We understand that this is a sensitive matter, and we assure you that we will treat any information you share with the utmost discretion. We await your reply with hope and anticipation. Sincerely, Isabella Hawkins. They sent the letter by airmail, knowing that it might take weeks to reach him, if it reached him at all. They could only wait and hope for a response. While they waited, Isabella decided to revisit the Red Cross, hoping to find some additional information about Edward's service record. She spent hours poring over dusty files, searching for any mention of his name, any detail that might shed light on his time in France. She found his enlistment papers, his medical records, his regimental assignments. She learned that he had been a skilled marksman, had been promoted to sergeant for his leadership qualities, and had been recommended for a commendation for bravery, which he had never received. And then she found something unexpected. A small, handwritten note tucked into his file, dated just a few days after he was reported missing. Sergeant Ross possible sighting. Witness reports seeing soldier matching his description, wounded, being taken prisoner by German forces. Unconfirmed. Isabella's heart leaped. A possible sighting. A glimmer of hope. Edward might have survived. He might have been captured, not killed. She showed the note to Eleanor, who was equally stunned. This changes everything, Eleanor said. If he was taken prisoner, there's a chance he might still be alive. The possibility, however remote, fueled their determination. They had to go to London. They had to find Major Hamilton. They had to uncover the truth, once and for all. The note felt like a whisper from across the ocean, a faint cry from a past that refused to stay silent. The waiting was the hardest, but the fire of discovery burned brighter than ever. Chapter 11. A Name Among the Missing. The 2 weeks leading up to their departure for London were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Isabella and Eleanor spent their days making preparations, arranging for travel documents, packing their belongings, and saying their goodbyes. Isabella wrote to Thomas, telling him about her journey, her quest to uncover the truth about Edward Ross. She didn't mention the possible sighting note, not wanting to raise his hopes unnecessarily. She simply told him that she was going to London to help a friend, and that she would be back as soon as she could. She received a reply from him, a short, hastily written letter, filled with his usual reassurances and expressions of love. He told her to be careful, to stay safe, and to come home soon. She clung to his letter, reading it over and over again, drawing strength from his words. They still hadn't received a reply from Major Hamilton. Isabella checked the mail every day, her heart sinking with each passing day that brought no response. She began to fear that he had died, that he had moved, that he simply didn't want to be found. The SS Caledonia was a large, imposing ship filled with passengers from all walks of life. There were soldiers returning home from leave, businessmen traveling on urgent errands, and families seeking a new life in America. There were also a few, like Isabella and Eleanor, who were traveling for more personal, more mysterious reasons. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and arduous. The weather was rough, the seas choppy, and the threat of German U-boats was ever present. Isabella spent most of her time on deck, gazing out at the vast expanse of the ocean, her thoughts filled with Edward, with Margaret, with Thomas. She reread Edward's journal countless times, searching for clues, for hidden meanings, for anything that might help them in their quest. She studied the photograph of Edward and James Hamilton, memorizing their faces, their features, hoping to recognize them if they ever crossed paths with someone who knew them. One evening, as she was standing at the railing, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Eleanor joined her. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the waves. What if my father is still alive? What if he's living somewhere under a different name, with a different life?" Isabella had considered the possibility, but she had dismissed it as unlikely. "It's been years, Eleanor," she said gently. "He would have contacted your mother. He would have come home. But what if he couldn't?" Eleanor insisted. What if he had amnesia? What if he was forced to stay away? Isabella didn't know what to say. She didn't want to give Eleanor false hope, but she also couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. The war had created so many strange, improbable scenarios. Anything was possible. As they neared the coast of England, the weather worsened. A fierce storm raged, tossing the ship about like a toy. Passengers huddled below deck, their faces pale with fear. Isabella and Eleanor held onto each other, praying for the storm to pass. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the storm subsided. The ship limped into the port of Liverpool, battered and bruised, but still afloat. Isabella and Eleanor disembarked, their legs shaky, their bodies weary, but their spirits undimmed. They had arrived in England. Their quest was about to begin in earnest. Their first stop was the War Office in London. They hoped to find more information about Edward's service record, perhaps even confirmation of the possible sighting note they had found at the Red Cross. They were met by a stern-faced official who listened to their story with a mixture of skepticism and indifference. He informed them that records were often incomplete, that many soldiers were still listed as missing in action, and that there was little chance of finding any new information after so many years. "But we have a note," Isabella insisted, from the Red Cross. "It says there was a possible sighting of Sergeant Ross being taken prisoner by German forces." The official sighed. "Madam," he said, "we receive hundreds of such reports. Most of them turn out to be false. Mistaken identity, wishful thinking." He retrieved Edward's file, a thin, tattered folder containing a few documents. He scanned the contents, his expression unchanging. "There's nothing here," he said. "Just the usual information. Enlistment papers, medical records, a report of his disappearance." He paused, his eyes flickering to a small, handwritten note attached to the back of the file. Isabella recognized it immediately. It was the same note they had seen at the Red Cross.
"See?"
Isabella said, pointing to the note. "It's there. A possible sighting." The official shrugged. "As I said, madam, these reports are rarely reliable. We have no confirmation, no further details. I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do for you." He wrote a name on a slip of paper. "This man, however, might assist you. He compiles records specifically for the missing. He is dedicated and might be the assistance you require." Isabella took the slip. Despair threatened, but she refused. They had come too far to give up now. They thanked the official and stepped out into the London fog. Even the air felt heavy with secrets and with waiting. Chapter 12. The Telegram That Shattered Silence. The name on the slip of paper was Mr. Alistair Finch, and his address led them to a small, cluttered office in a quiet corner of London. The building seemed to lean with age, and the windows were grimy, obscuring the view of the street below. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, a familiar aroma that had become almost comforting to Isabella. Mr. Finch was an elderly man, with a kind, wrinkled face and a gentle demeanor. He wore a pair of spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and his fingers were stained with ink. He listened patiently as Isabella and Eleanor explained their quest, showing him the journal, the unsent letter, and the photograph of Edward and James Hamilton. He examined the documents carefully, his eyes lingering on the photograph. "Blythewood," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I haven't heard that name in years." "You know it?" Isabella asked, her heart leaping with hope. Mr. Finch nodded. "I knew of it," he said. "It was the Hamilton family estate. I knew James Hamilton slightly. We served together, briefly, during the war. In a different regiment, though." "Do you know what happened to him?" Eleanor asked. "To Major Hamilton?" Mr. Finch sighed. "He returned to Blythewood after the war," he said.
"He was changed."
"Like so many of us. The war, it took its toll. We wrote to him," Isabella explained. "But we haven't received a reply." Mr. Finch's expression grew somber. "I'm afraid Major Hamilton passed away a few years ago," he said. "He became a recluse. Shut himself away in Blythewood Manor. Rarely saw anyone." Isabella and Eleanor exchanged a look of dismay. Another dead end. Another door closed. "But," Mr. Finch continued, "there was someone who looked after him. A housekeeper, I believe. A Mrs. He struggled to recall the name. "Mrs. Davies," he said finally. "Yes, that was it. Mrs. Davies. She might know something. She might be able to help you." He scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Isabella. "This is where she used to live," he said. "It's in the village of Blythewood, near the manor. I don't know if she's still there, but it's worth a try." Isabella and Eleanor thanked Mr. Finch profusely, their hopes rekindled. They had a new lead, a new name, a new destination. As they were leaving, Mr. Finch called out to them. "One more thing," he said. "There were rumors about Major Hamilton, about his time in the war, about what happened to Sergeant Ross." "What rumors?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Mr. Finch hesitated. "They were just rumors," he said. "Whispers in the dark. Nothing concrete. But some people said that Major Hamilton knew more about Sergeant Ross's disappearance than he ever let on. That he might have even been responsible." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. The suggestion was shocking, disturbing. Could Major Hamilton, Edward's friend, his commanding officer, have been involved in his disappearance? They left Mr. Finch's office, their minds reeling from this new revelation. The mystery of Edward Ross's fate had deepened, become more complex, more sinister. As they walked back to their small, rented room, a telegram boy approached them. He held out a sealed envelope, addressed to Isabella. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. She recognized the return address. It was from Thomas. She tore open the envelope, her hands shaking. The message was brief, devastating. Stop.
Urgent.
Thomas wounded. Serious condition. Return immediately.
Stop.
The telegram slipped from Isabella's grasp, fluttering to the ground. The world seemed to spin around her, the sounds of the city fading into a distant roar. Thomas. Wounded. Serious condition. She felt a wave of nausea, a surge of panic. She had to go back. She had to be with him. But what about Edward? What about their quest? What about the promise she had made? She looked at Eleanor, to the city around her, and felt her world collapsing, torn between duty and a long-held, desperate hope. The silence after the message's delivery was deafening. Chapter 13. Facing the Atlantic's divide. The telegram felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of Isabella. The words swam before her eyes. Thomas wounded. Serious condition. Return immediately. Repeating in a relentless loop, drowning out all other thoughts. Eleanor picked up the fallen telegram, her face etched with concern. She read the message, her own anxieties momentarily overshadowed by Isabella's distress. Oh, Isabella, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Isabella felt numb, paralyzed by fear and indecision. She had to go back to Thomas. He needed her. But what about their quest, their promise to Edward? They were so close, on the verge of uncovering the truth. Could she abandon their search now, just when they were finally making progress? I don't know what to do, Isabella stammered, her voice choked with emotion. I have to go back. But what about you? What about Edward? Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Isabella's arm. You have to go to Thomas, she said firmly. He's your fiancé. He needs you.
Don't worry about me.
Don't worry about Edward. I'll continue the search. I'll find Mrs. Davies. I'll uncover the truth. Isabella looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with gratitude and guilt.
But I can't ask you to do that, she said.
It's too much. It's not fair to you. It's not a burden, Isabella, Eleanor insisted. It's a purpose. It's something I need to do. For my father, for my mother, for myself. And for you. Isabella knew that Eleanor was right. She had to go back to Thomas. But the thought of leaving Eleanor, of abandoning their quest, filled her with a profound sense of sadness and regret. They returned to their rented room, their steps heavy, their hearts filled with conflicting emotions. Isabella immediately began making arrangements to return to New York. She booked passage on the first available ship, the RMS Mauretania, scheduled to depart from Southampton in 3 days. The next few days were a blur of activity. Isabella packed her belongings, sent a telegram to her parents, informing them of her return, and tried to gather her thoughts, to prepare herself for what lay ahead. She and Eleanor spent their remaining time together going over everything they had learned, reviewing the clues, discussing their next steps. Eleanor promised to keep Isabella informed of her progress, to write to her regularly, to share any new information she uncovered. I'll find the truth, Isabella, Eleanor vowed. I promise you. And when you're ready, when Thomas is better, you can come back. We'll finish this together. Isabella clung to Eleanor's words, drawing strength from her determination, her unwavering loyalty. She knew that she was leaving a part of herself behind in London, a part of herself that was deeply connected to Edward, to his story, to their shared quest. On the day of her departure, Isabella and Eleanor stood on the docks at Southampton, watching the RMS Mauretania prepare for its voyage across the Atlantic. The sky was gray, overcast, mirroring the mood of their farewell. They embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Thank you, Eleanor, Isabella whispered.
For everything.
For your friendship, your support, your belief. Go to Thomas, Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion.
He needs you.
And come back. When you can. Isabella nodded, unable to speak. She boarded the ship, her heart heavy with sorrow and uncertainty. As the ship pulled away from the dock, she stood at the railing, watching Eleanor grow smaller and smaller, until she was just a distant figure on the shore. The divide felt immense, the ocean stretching between her and the two people she cared for, the Atlantic a symbol of the war, of separation, and of the fractured pieces of the life she was trying to mend. She looked out to sea, and the gray waves seemed to swallow her hope and fear in equal measure. Chapter 14. Letters Across the Ocean. The voyage back to New York was a torment. Isabella spent most of her time in her cabin, unable to face the cheerful chatter of the other passengers, the forced gaiety that seemed so out of place with the turmoil in her heart. She was consumed by worry for Thomas, her mind filled with images of him lying wounded, suffering, perhaps even dying. She wrote to him every day, pouring out her love, her fears, her hopes for his recovery. She told him about her journey to London, about her quest to uncover the truth about Edward Ross, about her friendship with Eleanor. She didn't mention the possibility that Edward might still be alive, not wanting to burden him with false hope. She received no replies. The silence from across the ocean was deafening, amplifying her anxieties, her sense of isolation. She clung to the hope that he was simply too weak to write, that he was receiving the best possible care, that he was fighting to survive. She also wrote to Eleanor, keeping her updated on her journey, sharing her worries about Thomas, and expressing her longing to return to London, to continue their search. She received a few letters from Eleanor, short, hastily written notes, filled with updates on her progress. Dearest Isabella, I found Mrs. Davies. She's living in a small cottage in Blythewood, just as Mr. Finch said. She's reluctant to talk. Says she doesn't want to stir up old memories, old pain. But I'm working on her. I think she knows more than she's letting on. I'll keep you posted. Yours, Eleanor. Another letter arrived a few days later. Dearest Isabella, Mrs. Davies is starting to open up. She told me some disturbing things. About Major Hamilton, about his time in the war, about his relationship with my father. It's complicated. And shocking. I need to gather more information. I need to find proof. Pray for me, Isabella. And for Thomas. Yours, Eleanor. Isabella read Eleanor's letters over and over again, clinging to them as a lifeline, a connection to the world she had left behind. She was desperate for news, for answers, for any sign that their quest was not in vain. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the RMS Mauretania arrived in New York. Isabella rushed to the hospital where Thomas was being treated, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She found him lying in a bed, his body bandaged, his face pale and drawn. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. The doctors told her that he had been severely wounded, that he had lost a lot of blood, that his condition was critical. Isabella sat by his bedside, holding his hand, whispering words of love and encouragement. She stayed with him day and night, refusing to leave his side, willing him to live, to fight, to come back to her. Days turned into weeks, and still, Thomas remained unconscious. Isabella's hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing sense of despair. She felt helpless, powerless, unable to do anything but watch and wait. She received a small package in the mail. Eleanor had sent the journal. Its touch was grounding. One evening, as she was sitting by Thomas's bedside, she received another letter from Eleanor. This one was longer, more detailed, more explosive. Dearest Isabella, I have uncovered the truth. The full, horrifying truth. About my father, about Major Hamilton, about what happened on that battlefield in 1915. It's worse than I could have ever imagined. It involves betrayal, murder, and a cover-up that has lasted for years. I need to meet with a solicitor. I am scared, Isabella. But I cannot, will not, let this be buried again. Yours, Eleanor. Isabella read the letter, her blood running cold. Betrayal. Murder. A cover-up. What had Eleanor discovered? What terrible secrets had she unearthed? She was holding the worn journal when a nurse quietly entered. A slight change in the monitors. Isabella looked up, and there was a flicker of light, a flicker of hope in the sterile white of the hospital room. But the contents of the letter hung, heavy and dark, in the air around her. Chapter 15. The Truth Behind the Ink. Isabella sat frozen, Eleanor's letter clutched in her hand, the words betrayal, murder, and a cover-up echoing in her mind. The sterile smell of the hospital, the rhythmic beeping of the machines monitoring Thomas, faded into the background as the weight of Eleanor's revelation crashed down upon her. She reread the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. What had Eleanor discovered? What terrible secret had been hidden for so long? She felt a surge of fear, a sense of dread, but also a renewed determination to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Just then, she felt a slight pressure on her hand. She looked down at Thomas, his eyes still closed, but his grip on her hand had tightened, ever so slightly. A flicker of hope surged through her, a tiny spark in the darkness. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, confused. "Isabella?" he murmured, his voice weak and raspy. "Yes, Thomas, it's me," she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm here. He smiled weakly, a faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "You came back," he whispered. "I promised I would," she said, holding his hand tightly. "I'll always come back to you." He closed his eyes again, drifting back into unconsciousness. But Isabella knew that he was fighting, that he was trying to come back to her. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, telling her that he had passed the critical stage, that his condition was slowly improving. Isabella stayed by his bedside, watching over him, praying for his recovery. She continued to write to Eleanor, sharing her updates on Thomas's condition and expressing her eagerness to learn the truth about Edward Ross. Several days later, she received another letter from Eleanor. This one was even more detailed, more explicit, laying bare the full horror of what had happened in 1915. "Dearest Isabella, I have met with the solicitor, and he has advised me to proceed with caution. The evidence I have gathered is circumstantial, but it is compelling, and it points to a shocking conclusion. As you know, my father, Sergeant Edward Ross, was reported missing in action on October 28, 1915. The official story was that he was killed during an offensive, his body never recovered. But that was a lie. The truth is, my father was murdered. Not by the enemy, but by his own commanding officer, Major James Hamilton. Mrs. Davies, the former housekeeper at Blythewood Manor, finally confessed everything. She had been keeping the secret for years, protecting Major Hamilton out of fear and a misguided sense of loyalty. She told me that Major Hamilton and my father were rivals. They were both in love with my mother, Margaret. Major Hamilton was jealous of my father, of his relationship with my mother, of his popularity with the men. On the night of October 28th, during the offensive, Major Hamilton deliberately sent my father on a dangerous mission, a suicide mission, knowing that he would likely be killed. But my father survived. He was wounded, but he managed to make it back to the British lines. Major Hamilton, seeing that his plan had failed, took matters into his own hands. He found my father, weakened and vulnerable, and shot him. In cold blood. He then covered up his crime, reporting my father as missing in action, knowing that his body would never be found, that the truth would never be known. Mrs. Davies witnessed the whole thing. She saw Major Hamilton shoot my father. She helped him dispose of the body, burying it in a shallow grave near the battlefield. She kept the secret all these years, tormented by guilt, but afraid to speak out. Until now. I have the location of the grave, Isabella. I am going to France. I am going to find my father's remains. I am going to bring him home. Yours, Eleanor. Isabella read the letter, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. The truth was even more brutal, more heartbreaking than she could have ever imagined. Edward Ross, the man who had written so eloquently of love and hope, had been murdered by his own friend, his commanding officer, a man consumed by jealousy and ambition. She felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for justice. She wanted to scream, to shout, to expose Major Hamilton's crime to the world. But he was dead. He had escaped earthly justice. She was now torn. Thomas was recovering, slowly but steadily. He still needed, but she knew she needed to be there for Eleanor. The past and the present were colliding, demanding action, and she was caught between the two. She folded the letter, placed it with the journal. Chapter 16. Wartime Secrets Unveiled. Isabella's decision was agonizing. Thomas was recovering, his strength returning day by day, but he still needed her. Yet, Eleanor was embarking on a dangerous and emotionally fraught journey to France, seeking to unearth the truth about her father's murder and bring his remains home. Isabella felt a powerful obligation to both of them, a conflict that tore at her heart. She spent hours agonizing over her options, weighing her responsibilities, her desires, her fears. She reread Eleanor's letters, Edward's journal, Thomas's sparse but loving notes. She felt trapped between two worlds, two loves, two compelling obligations. Finally, she made her decision. She would stay with Thomas until he was strong enough to be left alone, and then she would join Eleanor in France. She knew that it was a risk, that she might be too late, that Eleanor might face danger on her own. But she couldn't abandon her friend, her commitment to uncovering the truth about Edward Ross. She explained her decision to Thomas, her voice trembling with emotion. He listened patiently, his eyes filled with understanding and a hint of sadness. He knew how much this quest meant to her, how deeply she was connected to Edward's story, to Eleanor's grief. "Go," he said, his voice weak but firm. "Go to Eleanor. Help her find her father. Bring him home. I'll be here, waiting for you." His words filled her with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She knew that he was still fragile, that he still needed her. But she also knew that he understood, that he supported her decision. She made arrangements for his continued care, ensuring that he would have everything he needed while she was gone. She contacted her parents, explaining the situation, asking for their help and support. Then, she booked passage on a ship bound for France, scheduled to depart in a week. She wrote to Eleanor, informing her of her decision, telling her that she would join her as soon as she could. "Dearest Eleanor, Thomas is recovering. He is strong enough for me to leave for a short time. I am coming to France. I will be there as soon as I can. Be careful, Eleanor.
Be strong.
We will face this together. Yours, Isabella." The week before her departure was filled with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Isabella spent her days by Thomas's bedside, watching over him, talking to him, reading to him. She cherished every moment with him, knowing that she was about to leave him again, uncertain of when she would return. She also spent time preparing for her journey to France. She gathered information about the area where Edward had been killed, studying maps, researching the battles that had been fought there. She packed her belongings, including Edward's journal, the unsent letter, and the photograph of Edward and James Hamilton. Finally, the day of her departure arrived. She said goodbye to Thomas, her heart heavy with sorrow and uncertainty. He held her hand tightly, his eyes filled with love and a hint of fear. "Come back to me, Isabella," he whispered. "Please come back." "I will," she promised, her voice choked with emotion. "I always will." She boarded the ship, her gaze fixed on the receding shoreline, her thoughts filled with Thomas, with Eleanor, with Edward. She was embarking on a journey into the heart of darkness, a journey to uncover a long-buried secret, a journey to bring peace to a restless spirit. The ship sailed into the vast expanse of the ocean, carrying Isabella towards a past that refused to stay silent, a past that demanded justice, a past that was about to be unveiled. The sea air felt different this time, charged not with fear of the crossing, but with the fear of what awaited her on the other side. She held the journal close. Chapter 17.
À risque et proposition.
Isabella arrived in France to a landscape scarred by war. Even though years had passed since the armistice, the evidence of the conflict was everywhere in the shattered villages, the pockmarked fields, the endless rows of white crosses in the military cemeteries. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of grief, the echoes of the battles that had raged across this land. She traveled to the small town near where Eleanor was staying, a place that had been on the front lines, a place that had witnessed unimaginable horrors. She found Eleanor in a modest inn, her face drawn and weary, but her eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Isabella," Eleanor greeted her, embracing her tightly. "You came." "I promised I would," Isabella said, her voice filled with emotion. "How is it? Have you?" Eleanor nodded. "I've found the place," she said. "The place where Mrs. Davies said my father was buried. It's not far from here. In a field, near a ruined farmhouse." Have you told anyone?" Isabella asked. "The authorities?" Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said. "Not yet. I needed to see it for myself first. To be sure." "And Mrs. Davies?" "She's fragile. She feels the weight of her silence. She's agreed to speak, but only when we are certain, when we exhume the body." Isabella understood Eleanor's hesitation. This was a delicate, dangerous situation. They were dealing with a murder, a cover-up, a secret that had been buried for years. They needed to be careful, to gather evidence, to ensure that they could bring the truth to light without putting themselves at risk. "We need a plan," Isabella said. "We need to be strategic." They spent the next few days carefully planning their next steps. They visited the field where Edward was supposedly buried, a desolate, overgrown patch of land, marked only by a few scattered stones. It was a haunting place, filled with the ghosts of the past, the whispers of the dead. They decided that they would exhume the body themselves under the cover of darkness. It was a risky proposition, illegal and potentially dangerous, but they felt they had no other choice. They needed to confirm Mrs. Davies' story, to find the physical evidence that would prove Edward's murder. They gathered the necessary tools, shovels, picks, lanterns, and waited for nightfall. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with a sense of dread. They were about to unearth a long-buried secret, a secret that could have far-reaching consequences. As darkness fell, they made their way to the field, their hearts pounding in their chests. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie, almost surreal light. The silence was broken only by the rustling of the wind in the tall grass, the distant hooting of an owl. They began to dig, their shovels striking the earth with a dull thud. The work was hard, grueling, their muscles aching, their hands raw and blistered. But they didn't stop. They were driven by a fierce determination, a need to uncover the truth, to bring justice to Edward Ross. As they dug deeper, the air grew heavy with the scent of decay, the smell of death. Isabella felt a wave of nausea, a surge of fear. She looked at Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes resolute. Suddenly, their shovels struck something hard. A bone. A skull. A human skeleton. They had found him. Edward Ross. Murdered, buried in a shallow grave, his body left to rot in the forgotten fields of France. Eleanor let out a cry, a primal scream of grief and rage. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Isabella knelt beside her, holding her close, tears streaming down her own face. They had found the truth. But the truth was even more brutal, more heartbreaking than they could have ever imagined. And as the wind howled and the darkness pressed in, they knew the most difficult and dangerous challenge still lay ahead. They had the body. Now they needed justice. Chapter 18. The journey begins. The discovery of Edward's remains was a turning point, a moment of profound grief and grim determination. Isabella and Eleanor had unearthed the physical evidence of a long-buried crime, but their task was far from over. They needed to bring Edward's body home, to expose Major Hamilton's treachery, and to ensure that justice was served, even in death. They carefully removed the remains from the shallow grave, wrapping them in a clean cloth, treating them with the reverence and respect they deserved. It was a somber, heart-wrenching task, a physical manifestation of the loss and betrayal that had haunted their lives. They knew they couldn't keep the discovery a secret any longer. They needed to inform the authorities, to present their evidence, to demand an investigation. But they also knew that they faced a formidable challenge. Major Hamilton was dead, but his legacy, his reputation remained. He had been a decorated war hero, a respected member of society. Accusing him of murder, posthumously, would be met with skepticism, resistance, perhaps even hostility. They decided to contact a solicitor in London, the one Eleanor had consulted earlier. They sent him a telegram, detailing their findings, requesting his urgent assistance. They also contacted Mrs. Davies, informing her of their discovery, asking her to prepare to give a formal statement to the authorities. The solicitor, Mr. Barrington, arrived in France a few days later. He was a sharp, experienced lawyer with a reputation for taking on difficult, controversial cases. He listened intently as Isabella and Eleanor recounted their story, examining the journal, the unsent letter, the photograph, and the newly discovered evidence of Edward's remains. "This is a grave matter," Mr. Barrington said, his voice serious. "Accusing a deceased war hero of murder, it will not be easy. We will need irrefutable proof. Mrs. Davies's testimony will be crucial, but we will also need corroborating evidence." He examined the remains, noting the location of the bullet wound, the evidence of a violent death. "We need a forensic examination," he said. "We need to prove that this is indeed Sergeant Ross, and that he was killed by a gunshot wound consistent with Mrs. Davies's account." He arranged for the remains to be transported to a nearby town, where a medical examiner could conduct a thorough examination. He also arranged for Mrs. Davies to be brought to the town, under his protection, to give her formal statement. The next few days were filled with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Isabella and Eleanor waited anxiously for the results of the forensic examination, for Mrs. Davies's testimony, for Mr. Barrington's assessment of their legal options. The medical examiner confirmed their findings. The remains were indeed those of a male, of similar age and build to Edward Ross. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range. The bullet was recovered, and it matched the type of ammunition used by British soldiers during the war. Mrs. Davies, frail but resolute, gave her formal statement to the authorities. She recounted, in vivid detail, how she had witnessed Major Hamilton shoot Edward Ross, how she had helped him bury the body, how she had kept the secret for years, tormented by guilt and fear. Mr. Barrington, armed with the forensic evidence and Mrs. Davies's testimony, prepared to present their case to the British authorities. He knew that it would be an uphill battle, that they would face resistance from those who sought to protect Major Hamilton's reputation, to preserve the idealized image of a war hero. But he was determined to fight for justice, to expose the truth, to bring closure to Eleanor and Isabella, to honor the memory of Edward Ross. The journey to justice was about to begin, a journey that would test their courage, their resilience, and their faith in the power of truth. As they prepared, the weight of responsibility felt heavy, but the determination in their hearts burned brighter than ever. This journey, back through the proper channels, felt longer and more difficult than any they had taken so far. Chapter 19. Hope and Despair in Equal Measure. The news of Edward Ross's murder and the accusation against Major James Hamilton sent shockwaves through the British establishment. The story was splashed across the headlines of newspapers, sparking a fierce debate between those who defended Hamilton's heroic reputation and those who demanded justice for Edward Ross. The War Office, initially reluctant to reopen a case from so many years ago, was forced to launch an official investigation. They interviewed Mrs. Davies, examined the forensic evidence, and reviewed the wartime records of both Edward Ross and James Hamilton. Isabella and Eleanor found themselves caught in a media frenzy, their lives scrutinized, their motives questioned. They were hailed as heroines by some, vilified as traitors by others. The pressure was intense, the emotional toll immense. Eleanor, in particular, struggled with the weight of the revelations. She had grown up believing that her father had died a hero's death, only to discover that he had been murdered by a man he trusted, a man who had been lauded as a hero. The betrayal was profound, the grief overwhelming. Isabella stayed by Eleanor's side, offering her unwavering support and friendship. She understood the pain that Eleanor was going through, the sense of loss and disillusionment. She also knew that they had to remain strong, to fight for justice, to ensure that Edward's story was finally told, that his killer was exposed. The investigation dragged on for months, filled with legal wrangling, bureaucratic delays, and attempts to discredit Mrs. Davies's testimony. The Hamilton family, wealthy and influential, used their resources to defend Major Hamilton's reputation, hiring lawyers, public relations experts, and even private investigators to try to undermine the case. Isabella received regular updates from Mr. Barrington, the solicitor, who kept her informed of the progress of the investigation. He warned her that the case was complex, that the outcome was uncertain. She also received letters from Thomas, who was recovering steadily, his strength returning with each passing day. He expressed his support for her efforts, his admiration for her courage and determination. He urged her to stay strong, to fight for justice, to come home soon. "My dearest Isabella, I am so proud of you. You are fighting for what is right, for what is just. I know it is difficult, but you must not give up. Edward Ross deserves justice. Eleanor deserves peace. I am getting stronger every day. I miss you terribly. Please come home soon. Yours always, Thomas." Isabella clung to Thomas's letters, drawing strength from his love and support. She longed to be with him, to return to the life they had planned together. But she knew that she couldn't leave France until the investigation was complete, until Edward's story had been told, until justice had been served. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Isabella received a disturbing piece of news. Mrs. Davies, the key witness in the case, had suddenly died. Her death was ruled as natural causes, but Isabella and Eleanor suspected foul play. They feared that the Hamilton family, desperate to silence her, had somehow orchestrated her death. The loss of Mrs. Davies was a devastating blow. Her testimony was crucial to their case, and her death cast a shadow of doubt over the entire investigation. Isabella and Eleanor felt a surge of despair, a sense of hopelessness. They had come so far, fought so hard, only to be met with setback after setback. They considered giving up, returning home, abandoning their quest. But they knew that they couldn't. They had made a promise to Edward, to Eleanor's mother, to themselves. They had to see this through no matter the cost. They were now fighting not only for justice, but for the memory of two people robbed of life, of peace, and of truth. Even as despair threatened, a tiny flicker of hope remained. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Despite Mrs. Davies's death, the investigation continued. Mr. Barrington, the solicitor, argued that her previous statements, given under oath and corroborated by the forensic evidence, were still admissible in court. He also presented new evidence, uncovered during the investigation, that further implicated Major Hamilton in Edward Ross's murder. He revealed that Hamilton had a history of violence and jealousy, that he had been reprimanded on several occasions for his aggressive behavior towards fellow officers. He also presented evidence that Hamilton had falsified records, manipulating reports to cover up his actions on the night of Edward's death. The War Office, facing mounting public pressure and undeniable evidence, finally reached a verdict. They concluded that Sergeant Edward Ross had indeed been murdered by Major James Hamilton, that Hamilton had acted out of jealousy and personal animosity, and that he had deliberately covered up his crime. The verdict was a victory, a triumph of truth over lies, of justice over impunity. Isabella and Eleanor felt a surge of relief, a sense of closure, but also a profound sadness. The truth had been revealed, but it couldn't bring Edward back. It couldn't erase the years of grief and uncertainty. The Hamilton family, disgraced and humiliated, issued a public apology, acknowledging Major Hamilton's guilt and expressing their regret for the pain he had caused. They also agreed to pay compensation to Eleanor, a small measure of restitution for the loss she had suffered. Isabella and Eleanor traveled back to the field where Edward had been buried. They arranged for his remains to be exhumed and transported back to England, where he would be given a proper burial, with full military honors. They stood by his graveside as his coffin was lowered into the ground, tears streaming down their faces. They had fulfilled their promise. They had brought him home. Isabella knew that it was time for her to return to New York, to Thomas. She had been away for too long, and he needed her. She had also received a telegram from him, informing her that he had been discharged from the hospital, that he was waiting for her at home. She said goodbye to Eleanor, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They had been through so much together. They had forged a bond that would last a lifetime. "Thank you, Isabella," Eleanor said, embracing her tightly. "For everything. For your friendship, your support, your courage. You helped me find my father. You helped me find peace. And you helped me," Isabella said, her voice choked with emotion. "You helped me understand the true meaning of love, of duty, of sacrifice." They parted, knowing that they would always be connected, bound together by the shared experience of uncovering a long-buried secret, of bringing justice to a murdered soldier. Isabella returned to New York, to Thomas. He was waiting for her, his face thinner, his body weaker, but his eyes filled with the same love and devotion she had always known. They embraced, holding each other tightly, as if they would never let go. They had both been through so much, they had both faced their own battles, their own losses. But they had survived. They had found their way back to each other. "Welcome home, Isabella," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "Welcome home." Isabella knew that she was home. She had fulfilled her duty. She had honored her promise. She had found a measure of peace, a sense of closure. But the echoes of the past, the whispers of Edward Ross, would always remain with her. A reminder of the enduring power of love, the enduring cost of war, the enduring need for truth and justice. She knew that, even as she embraced her own future, part of her would always remain in that quiet field in France. She looked at Thomas and started to explain, to recount it all. Epilogue. Years passed. Isabella and Thomas married, built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of shared moments. They had children, grandchildren, and they often spoke of Eleanor, of Edward Ross, of the extraordinary journey they had undertaken together. The scars of the war, both physical and emotional, gradually faded, but they never completely disappeared. Thomas still carried the shrapnel in his leg, a constant reminder of the horrors he had witnessed, the sacrifices he had made. Isabella still held onto Edward's journal, the unsent letter, the photograph of him and James Hamilton, tangible reminders of a past that had shaped her life, her understanding of love and loss. Eleanor remained in England, rebuilding her life, finding solace in the knowledge that her father's story had finally been told, that his killer had been exposed. She never married, dedicating her life to honoring her father's memory, working to preserve the history of the war, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who had fought and died were never forgotten. She and Isabella remained close friends, exchanging letters, visiting each other whenever they could. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared grief and shared purpose, remained strong, unbreakable. One autumn day, many years later, Isabella, now an elderly woman, sat by the window of her home, overlooking a peaceful garden. The sunlight streamed through the glass, warming her face, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She held Edward's journal in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn leather, the faded ink. She opened it, rereading the familiar entries, the words that had once been so urgent, so desperate, now imbued with a sense of timelessness, of enduring humanity. She came to the final entry, the single sentence that had started it all, "I will return." She smiled sadly, remembering the young soldier who had written those words, the soldier who had never returned, the soldier whose life had been cut short by betrayal and violence. She thought of Eleanor, of Thomas, of all those who had been touched by Edward's story, by the long shadow of the war. She thought of the sacrifices that had been made, the love that had endured, the truth that had finally been revealed. She closed the journal, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She had lived a long and full life, a life filled with love, with purpose, with meaning. She had faced her own battles, her own losses, but she had also known great joy, great friendship, great love. She looked out at the garden, at the vibrant colors of the autumn leaves, at the clear blue sky. She felt a sense of peace, a sense of completion. She had kept her promise. She had returned. And in a way, so had Edward Ross. His story had been told. His memory had been honored. His spirit, finally, was at rest. The journal felt warm in her hands, a final whisper from the past, and a gentle confirmation of a life lived fully, truthfully, and with enduring love. The sunlight caught the dust, and for a brief, beautiful moment, it felt like the past and present were holding hands. The end.